Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to our 2024 Weil Lecture on American Citizenship, America at a Crossroads. I'm Jim White, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. This evening's event is hosted by our Institute for the Arts and Humanities. You'll hear more about our speaker, Judy Woodruff, in just a few moments, but I want to spend a few minutes talking about the importance of having lectures like these on a university campus. Lectures that explore all facets of the democratic ideal, how to preserve it, how to improve it, and why it matters. We are all acutely aware of how polarized our nation has become in recent years. And I'm not just talking about political polarization. There are generational divides, religious divides, cultural divides, and many, many others. How do we navigate them all? How do we help our students do so? I believe that universities are central to working through these challenges. We are educators, we are conveners, we are seekers of knowledge, and we are committed to the free exchange of ideas. A strong democracy depends on having a population of engaged citizens who are committed to open inquiry and working with others to embrace challenging topics. At Carolina, this is such a foundational belief that we have even made it a core tenet in the university's strategic plan. This initiative, called Promoting Democracy, seeks to inspire a culture of listening, a respect, and civil discussion for advancing democratic values and effectiveness on our campus and beyond. Events like the Weil Lecture on American Citizenship are one way we are fulfilling this goal. We're serving not just our students with events like these, but also the greater public. And thank you for being here. That's part of our role as a public university, to reach beyond the campus and engage with the community that we serve. We also just recently launched a new school within the College of Arts and Sciences. This new school, called the School of Civic Life and Leadership, or SKIL for short, will be a home dedicated to the practice of public discourse and help, along with our many excellent departments, provide our students with a grounding in the foundations of the American democratic experience. SKIL is interdisciplinary, representing faculty with appointments in academic fields across the arts and sciences. That's because every student, regardless of their major, needs to have the essential skills of communicating effectively, listening deeply, and debating respectfully. I believe that not shying away from these difficult conversations is key to breaking out of the societal gridlock we seem to be in. And I'm sure our speaker, Judy Woodruff, will have much more to say on this topic. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Pat Parker, Director of the Institute for the Arts and Humanities and the Reuel W. Tyson Distinguished Professor of Humanities. Her home department is communication, which is a central place at Carolina where we are teaching our students the essential skills of written and oral communication, rhetoric, debate, and critical thinking. Please join me in welcoming Pat, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dean White. Good evening. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker tonight, I want to acknowledge other members of the university's leadership that are, who are here with us tonight, and also add a few more words of welcome. In addition to Dean Jim White from the College of Arts and Sciences, I'm very pleased to welcome Senior Associate Dean for Fine Arts and Humanities, Elizabeth Engelhardt, as well as the Senior Associate Dean for Social Sciences and Global Programs, Dr. Noreen McDonald. Thank you both for being here, and thank you. We certainly appreciate the thoughtful partnership with the college. As Dean White has noted, the College of Arts and Sciences is leading the way in helping to prepare an engaged citizenry. The Institute for the Arts and Humanities is a central part of that work. We are a national model for faculty support and a sure place on this campus for focusing on the core principles at the foundation of a global public research university. We develop and sponsor public dialogues, lectures like this one, and conferences to foster conversations across differences, demonstrating the centrality of the arts and humanities on critical issues. I also want to, in addition to the campus leadership, I want to extend and welcome and extend my gratitude to members of the Weil family. It has been a pleasure getting to know David, and I look forward to spending time with you, David, and Emily, and your extended family after the lecture. But thank you very much for being here and for supporting this lecture. And finally, it is my pleasure to welcome each of you who are here. I'm especially pleased to see so many students who I know for sure are not just here for the Campus Life Experience credit. I do know that for sure because students from disciplines across campus have expressed their enthusiasm for Judy Woodruff's visit to Carolina. And in fact, some of those lucky students had a private lunch with Judy earlier today at the Institute. And so welcome, students. And of course, there you can access the QR code in the lobby after the lecture for CLE credit. So there will be signs, several signs posted there. Now, before I bring Judy to the podium, allow me to tell you just a bit about the lecture. You can read more about it in the program, but I will tell you that the Institute for the Arts and Humanities has hosted the Weil Lecture on American Citizenship since the year 2000. This lecture was established in 1915 to honor brothers Henry and Solomon Weil, to broaden the discussion of the concept of citizenship, American citizenship in the United States. And I think I'd like to pause a moment just to think about the context of that moment, 1915. It was a time, of course, of great turmoil, with the Great War raging globally. And in the American South, Jim Crow laws were being codified that threatened the very lives of American citizens. And so it is within that context that the Weil brothers family, and in looking at the traditions of the importance of citizenship that the promise of the United States presented, that they were prescient enough to bring this lecture to this university campus as a place to have important conversations about American citizenship. It is truly my honor as director of the Institute to continue that legacy. Some of our past Weil lecturers have included Eleanor Roosevelt and President Jimmy Carter, and more recently we welcomed Attorney General Eric Holder and Senator Claire McCaskill. So tonight, Judy Woodruff joins this list of distinguished speakers for the Weil Lectures on American Citizenship. And now to introduce our distinguished speaker. A senior correspondent and the former anchor and managing editor of PBS NewsHour, Judy Woodruff has covered politics for over 5 decades. Just to name a few of her appointments, she served as a White House correspondent for NBC News. She was chief Washington correspondent for PBS. She was anchor and correspondent at CNN. And in 2013, she and the late Gwen Ifill were the first 2 women to co-anchor a national news broadcast. After Gwen Ifill's death, Judy was named sole anchor. She's also had several other experiences. She served on several boards, including the Freedom Forum and the Carnegie Corporation of New York. She also serves on a board at a school that will remain unnamed. She is also, it's Marge. Can't do that. She is also the founding co-chair of the International Women's Media Foundation, which supports and encourages women and non-binary journalists through awards, opportunities, resources, emergency aid, and more. And Judy's work has received numerous recognitions and accolades. Here are some of a few of those. She's the recipient of the Emmy Lifetime Achievement Award, the Radcliffe Medal, the Poynter Medal for Lifetime Achievement for Journalism, and the Gwen Ifill Press Freedom Award for the Committee to Protect Journalists. And I want to name one more because it has a citation that I think will help us to set the stage for our lecture tonight. In 2020, she received the prestigious Peabody Award for Journalistic Integrity. The award... The award citation reads in part, quote, "Throughout her career, Woodruff has been an outspoken advocate for the First Amendment, upholding the importance of a free and unfettered press as critical to the survival of our democracy. Never has there been more critical. Never has journalistic integrity been more critical than where we find ourselves today," end quote. We are delighted to welcome this seasoned journalist and champion of democratic values to the stage tonight. She will share her experiences from her current reporting project, Judy Woodruff Presents, America at a Crossroads. Please join me in welcoming Judy Woodruff to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you all so very much. Thank you, Dean Pat Parker, for that most generous introduction. Thank you, Dean White, for your warm welcome. It is wonderful to be back on the magnificent campus of the University of North Carolina. And I can say that even as a loyal alumna of that school down the road in Durham, who cheers hard for the Duke Blue Devils, whether we face off at the Dean Dome or Cameron Indoor Stadium or in the NCAA Finals. But as for being back in Chapel Hill, my longtime dear friend, Carolina alum Joel Fleischman, who has served on the Duke faculty for decades, but he lives here in Chapel Hill. He has this unforgettable voicemail message on his home telephone telling callers from virtually everywhere on the planet that they have reached his, quote, sylvan retreat in the southern part of heaven. That's Joel. I am incredibly honored to have been invited to deliver the Will Lecture on American Citizenship, and thank you to members of the Will family who I understand are here this afternoon. But especially given your previous speakers, as Dean Parker said, 2 presidents of the United States, including the one I covered for decades, and who is remarkably still with us at the age of 99, Jimmy Carter, Eleanor Roosevelt, civil rights leader Julian Bond, whom I covered as a reporter in Atlanta years ago, so many others, including my dear late friend, a Tar Heel through and through, the longtime Supreme Court appellate lawyer and former acting U.S. Solicitor General Walter Dellinger, who delivered this lecture. Yes. Walter delivered this lecture in 1997. You may not know this, but when Walter was the Assistant U.S. Attorney General, this was in 1995, so this was 2 years before, and the Tar Heels were playing Arkansas in the Final Four, he crafted a meticulous legal brief that argued it was unconstitutional to cheer against Carolina, and he sent it to President Clinton, who, of course, Arkansas native. So to follow in all of their footsteps is daunting. And I am especially pleased to be here at the Institute of the Arts and Humanities at their behest, of course, led by Dean Parker, with its active agenda, mission of empowering faculty, fostering an inclusive community, asking hard questions, and promoting collaboration. We've never needed all of those things more than we do today. So I just want to say at the outset how fortunate I feel to be an American citizen. Maybe it's stating the obvious, but I hope I never take for granted how lucky I am, how lucky all of us are to have this connection with this country. I was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and as an Army brat growing up in a military family, I spent the next dozen plus years moving around the world, to Germany as a 5-year-old, to an Army base in Missouri as an 8-year-old, then to Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, then back for a while in Oklahoma, then off to Taiwan for a couple of years, living with grandparents in Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina for a spell, and then to Augusta, Georgia, my father's final posting in the Army where I finished high school. So I grew up seeing different parts of the country and the world and having a taste of what the rest of the world looks and feels and sounds like. I've always been curious about other places and other cultures, their histories, what made them what they are. I love to travel. I feel I can't learn enough about distant lands and people. But all of that has led me to recognize there is something extraordinary about this place, the United States, that makes it not only the homeland that we love, but the place so many people from elsewhere want to move to, or at least to visit. And I tell you all this as a little background before I devote my remarks to the reporting project that Dean Pat Parker described. It's what I've undertaken for this year and last year. We're calling it America at a Crossroads, trying to understand why the country is so divided. In my 50 years plus of reporting on American politics, going back to the days I covered Georgia state government, Atlanta city politics, through decades of covering both Democrats and Republican administrations in Washington, through the 2000 contested presidential election, and so much more, I have never seen Americans as politically and personally divided as they are today. So as I made plans to step aside from the anchor desk, the PBS NewsHour at the end of 2022, knowing that I wanted to continue reporting and trying to decide what to focus on, it hit me almost immediately. What has happened to get us to the point where many families don't even want to gather together around the Thanksgiving dinner table, where neighbor has stopped speaking to neighbor, where people are unfriending longtime friends on Facebook? With that question in mind, with the series titled, as I said, America at a Crossroads, in February of last year, 2023, I set out with a NewsHour producer, now it's a little team of producers, to spend 2 years leading up to the next presidential election, talking with scholars and writers, political scientists, people who have studied our political system, and most important, and community leaders, and most important, with ordinary Americans, trying to understand the nature of our division, what is driving it, what Americans themselves have to say about it, and to ask if there are ways we might heal. Since then, over the last 13 months, we've traveled to 19 states and the District of Columbia. We have filed 27 America at a Crossroads reports for the PBS NewsHour, which have aired every other Wednesday and which live permanently on the NewsHour website if you want to catch them, and on our YouTube playlist. In December, we aired a special for PBS, pulling together some of the most important work we did last year, and we are continuing to report every other week right up through the end of this year. I just came back from Oregon, where I spent a few days looking at why many people in the rural eastern part of the state want to join Idaho and secede from Oregon. For example, there's a story, we had just come from Tennessee looking at the arguments they're having there over gun rights, gun control. We have plans to go to Alaska in a few weeks to look at primary reform. We have a full agenda, and we will continue through the end of this year. What have we learned? A lot. We started at the Pew Research Center in Washington, where their experts showed us public opinion polls going back 30 years to the early 1990s, when then Speaker of the House of Representatives Newt Gingrich issued his Contract with America, rejecting pretty much the entire agenda of then President Bill Clinton. They showed us how the American people at that point, where they were on the issues, and how much farther apart we are today, 30 years later. If we were here in the early 90s on issues from immigration to abortion to government spending, we're now here. When Americans are asked the same questions, Republicans are here, Democrats are here. Now it's farther apart. And they showed us how the time around the election of President Obama and then the Tea Party revolution around 2010, how that period further deepened Americans' differences with one another. But perhaps what was most striking, and what was most striking to me, was they shared surveys that show opinions by Americans about people in the other political party have significantly darkened over the decades, and even more so recently. In 2016, 47% of Republicans told the pollsters that they thought Democrats were immoral. 47%, that's high. But today, that figure is 72%. For Democrats, there's been almost as pronounced an increase from 35 to 63%. The same when Republicans were asked if they think Democrats were dishonest. That shot up from 45%, again in 2016, to 72% just today. And almost again as much for Democrats' views of Republicans when asked if they think Republicans are dishonest. We then spoke with a psychologist and an academic, Liliana Mason, who has studied why this has happened. She told us there's long been an understanding that as humans tend to gather into groups, they take sides against the other. More than defense, it quickly becomes offense. Her research shows how increasingly Americans have merged their political identity into their personal identity. That in this new media environment, as we're surrounded by reminders of who's on what side, when opinion, even conspiracy theory, carries more weight than fact-based information, people are increasingly identifying themselves and each other by what party they belong to. Are you an R? Are you a D? If you are, then I know who you are, and that's all I need to know. You couple that with findings about just how much more negative our views are of people in the other party, and you begin to get the picture. So that when we interviewed a group of Republican and Democratic voters in Iowa and Pennsylvania, respectively, we found they have pretty harsh views of people on the other side. Two-time Trump voters in Iowa, people who had voted for him in 2016 and 2020, told us they feel labeled by Democrats, even by their own family members. When we asked them what they would think if their son or daughter married a Democrat, one woman replied, "My daughter did. It didn't go well. We're now estranged," she said. In fairness, a few said they would accept it, but one man told me kind of unforgettably, he said, "My two daughters, I love them, they know, and they love me," but he said they are both very liberal, they know I'm a Trump guy, and he said, "We don't understand each other, but we love each other, and we continue to talk about it." And yet others in these groups described what I have to say are really painful divides in their family, painful discussions that they've had, and painful estrangement. And when we asked one group of Republican voters in Iowa if they thought Democrats could be people of deep faith, deep Christian faith in particular, every member of one of the panels said no. And when we asked why, they said they didn't think it was possible to be a Christian and to believe that abortion is acceptable. They also brought up LGBTQ, and they singled out transgender individuals. One panelist said, in fact, a couple said, in so many words, God made us, he knows your gender at birth, it's not possible to change it. When soon after that, we interviewed a focus group of Democratic voters in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and we shared the comments of those Republicans with them about how it was impossible to be a Christian and a Democrat, their reaction was to shake their heads and say, that's ridiculous. They went on to describe, a couple of them, and very passionately, their belief that Jesus accepted all people, how he cared for the poor, the sick, people who are different. Some said the Iowa Republicans who support Donald Trump act like they're in a cult. We visited Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I was born and still have family, a city that saw the massacre of its black population 100 years ago, the firebombing of the prosperous Greenwood neighborhood, so-called Black Wall Street, in 1921, when a white mob murdered a few hundred black residents. Tulsa buried that history for decades. I never knew of it growing up. My family members who did grow up in Tulsa hadn't heard of it until just a few years ago. And now in Tulsa, there's a young Republican mayor who's trying to bring it to light, excavate the history, heal whatever, in any way that he can, the lingering divide, explore ways the city might somehow begin to make up for descendants, make up for what happened, but he's getting pushback from conservatives in particular. There's a chapter of a group called Moms for Liberty who argue, this is a group that was started in Florida, they argue that racial history should not be taught in a way that makes school children feel uncomfortable, which raises the question, how do you teach history if you don't teach all of history? We visited a rural public school district in northeastern Pennsylvania where similar rules have been passed by their local school board and where formerly sedate school board meetings have now become shouting matches between members and parents who want to take books off library shelves. They had a number of books were banned, or at least were examined. They ended up only banning 10 books, but they had a scouring, a complete inspection of the contents of the school library. They also want to limit sports options for transgender women students at a time when there were none in the school district. But proponents told me they just want to protect students. They just want it, they said, just in case, we want to protect our students. In searching for what's behind these divisions, we traveled to Steubenville, Ohio, formerly thriving steel town. Even though the steel industry began moving out of the United States decades ago, Democrats have long been the champions of organized labor, and even though this area voted narrowly for Barack Obama for president in 2008, by 2020, it went almost 70% for Donald Trump. It's been the beneficiary of significant federal dollars under President Biden and previous Democrats and Republicans. But under this president, they've gotten considerable COVID relief money from which they've used leftover funds in Steubenville going toward constructing a new high school, where young people, a new science, math, and engineering building there, where young people will have a chance to gain knowledge and learn skills that are going to serve them well into the future. Federal money is also being directed to social services in the area, including a food pantry, where we found a couple picking up groceries even though the husband works full-time, because they say they cannot afford to feed themselves and their 2 children. Both of them voted, they said, for Donald Trump in 2020. They said they're going to vote for him again this year because they believe he will bring down the cost of food and the cost of gas. One resident told a visitor to Steubenville last year, "We are the flyover place in flyover country." They feel forgotten. They and so many we talk to in the community feel ignored by their leaders in Ohio and in Washington. A number of them told us they said, we believe Donald Trump is listening to us and we believe he's going to make big change. There's no doubt the COVID pandemic helped contribute to our divide. We traveled to Sarasota, Florida in December to visit what is called an alternative health clinic set up by people who don't trust the COVID vaccine and are not getting vaccinated. It's not clear how many followers they have, but they are offering services. The day we were there were doctors and nurses serving people who arrived. They're offering services to this growing I think you would say, subset of Americans who say they just don't trust the healthcare system anymore. They see the CDC and the NIH as part of a huge government conspiracy. Other factors at work behind so much of our division have to do with many Americans feeling the country is changing in ways that threaten their livelihood and the lifestyle they know. The issues around immigration, what should be done about it, and with what to do about diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, accusations that efforts to make sure that groups that have been historically excluded are actually giving them, they say, too much of an advantage. They're calling it woke. You've heard about it. They say that they are being disadvantaged by this effort to make up for people who were left out for too long. Another cause, and I'm flying along here because it's a complicated set of issues and factors that we are finding in our reporting. Another cause is clearly the news media, especially cable television, so much of television news, talk radio, the heavily opinionated internet, and in particular social media, all of which allows us to surround ourselves with news and information that confirms what we already are inclined to believe and sometimes sends people down rabbit holes of conspiracy theories, rather than exposing us to mainly fact-based, fact-checked news and information that allows us to weigh what's accurate, to see broad analysis, to compare ideas, and then to make up our own minds. The sort of journalism that I grew up on, but that now makes me feel like a dinosaur. We also learned that what's contributing to speeding up these changes is the collapse of so much traditional journalism. You see it here. In North Carolina, we see it across the country. Newspapers downsizing or going under altogether. Over the past decade, some 2,500, more than that, local newspapers in America have shut down. Most of them weeklies, but many, 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 hundreds and hundreds of dailies have also shut down. These are the essential gatherers of information in our country, and given what the Founding Fathers believed, that a free press needed to be protected, I worry a lot about what this means for our democracy. You have to worry about it. In our travels last year, we visited the panhandle of Texas, a small town called Canadian, which, by the way, has just been at the center of another terrible set of wildfires just this month, the worst in Texas state history. So they've been very much on my mind. We went there last year because after decades of keeping a weekly newspaper afloat, the owner and editor, an amazing woman named Lori Brown, had to shut it down last spring because she just didn't have the advertising anymore and could no longer pay salaries to her tiny staff. We found this largely conservative community, very conservative area. They vote heavily Republican, community in mourning. As they described in the words of one rancher I spent an entire afternoon with, he said, "This newspaper has been the glue that held us all together. It's told story after story about my family and about all of our families because it's covered weddings, births, it writes obituaries. It has told me about my children and my grandchildren's high school football results. It tells us how many arrests were made last week, and he ticked off one thing after another that he missed about this newspaper. There's a professor at Syracuse University, a woman named Joanna Dunaway, who has done a lot of research on this, who told us that local news is just something that reminds people of what they have in common, both their challenges and their shared identities, their shared culture, their shared community. As it declines, she says, and she's written in her research, as it declines, polarization increases. So you have rapidly changing technology that's had this effect on the news media. As the internet has risen, print media and virtually every other kind of media has changed and been in upheaval as a result. But you've had this unsettling effect on our cohesion as a society, as has globalization, as have moves toward free trade, turmoil and oppression and lack of opportunity in other countries that have led more people to try to come Where? To the United States, even if they don't have documentation. And no, they may not get it for a long time. Many are filling desperately needed jobs that native-born Americans don't want to do. But the images, the television pictures at the border are unsettling and contributing to a sense that things are simply out of control. We have a lot of reasons to be anxious, but what's also contributing to our increased polarization are elements of our political system that play on our worst fears, increasingly rewarding partisanship, disincentivizing cooperation for the greater good. Our primary election system with its winner-take-all endgame, the evolution of our political parties, especially in Washington, into systems that reward loyalty above all and penalize compromise, the enormous amount of money that's pouring into our election process, into candidates and into party coffers, much of it aimed at specific outcomes, pulling candidates farther to the left if they're a Democrat, farther to the right if they're a Republican. And our political leaders, those who signal not just that the other side is wrong, but that they are un-American, evil, or simply deplorable. Leaders who demonize their opponents. When we come to believe that the other side is not just poorly informed, but out to destroy the country, it's a lot harder to find common ground. So where does that leave us? Where does all this leave us as citizens? It's a lot to think about. It can get overwhelming. It leaves us, in my humble view, with a greater responsibility than ever to keep our heads about us, to be rational, to remember what sets our democracy apart, and of the need to respect viewpoints other than our own. If our political leaders are not modeling respect and restraint, it's up to us to do that. If you look at the website, and I did the other day, of the Department of Homeland Security, under the section under U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, on the page that asks, should I consider U.S. citizenship? It lists the rights and responsibilities of U.S. citizens. Among other things, the right to express yourself, to worship freely, the right to vote, freedom to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We hear about those freedoms a lot. We hear less about the responsibilities listed on that page. The responsibility to support and defend the Constitution, of course, but also to stay informed on the issues affecting your community, to serve on a jury, to participate in the democratic process, to defend the country if that becomes necessary. And it says, one of the responsibilities, to respect the rights, beliefs, and opinions of others. That's what, in my humble view, we need to do more of right now. It's part of our role as citizens. If the leaders are not modeling it, we can uphold those responsibilities ourselves. As Utah's Republican Governor Spencer Cox told me in an interview just a few weeks ago about his project he started with the National Governors Association to get political leaders across the country, governors and others, to, in his words, disagree better. He said, it is un-American to hate other Americans, which I took to be a pretty powerful statement. When he said that, I thought of a naturalization ceremony that I attended in 1990 when our daughter, the youngest of three, she's adopted from South Korea, two older brothers, biological sons, my husband and I had, and we wanted an international family. We adopted Lauren. She was just a year and a half old. She was taking part in this ceremony, we all were, for toddlers from all over the world to become U.S. citizens. The speaker was then Massachusetts Congressman Silvio Conte, whose little granddaughter was in the group. And in his booming New England accent, Congressman Conte told the crowd of about, 100 of us, You can go to France, but you'll never be a Frenchman. You can go to Germany, but you'll never be a German. But today, you are all Americans, which is why this is the greatest country in the world. And as about 36 little kids with several, I guess from several dozen different countries, waved their tiny American flags, I don't think there was a dry eye in the room. America is special. It's not perfect, but it's special. And we need to keep working on those things that keep us from the flaws that we know that exist, the things that we know we want to keep working on. We've got to do that. So yes, it's special, but it's only special if we, as American citizens, do our part to keep it that way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judy. And now we'll have time for a Q&A period. I'll kick things off with a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the rest of you, any of you who might have questions. And I believe we have microphones on either side, and so if you'll make your way to, I think you have to come around the guests who are seated there and just come to the microphone for your questions. But I'll give you the cue for that, so start thinking about your questions. Thank you, Judy, so much for that inspiring talk. I say inspiring because, as you know, you and I have been communicating for about a month. We had a podcast conversation. I've been watching your reporting. And I, as a communication scholar, I believe that you've adopted a methodology that is opening up space for conversation. So that's something that is inspiring me. But I want to start by asking you, you know, I've been thinking a lot about the importance of wisdom and discernment lately in uncertain times. And so I wonder, how do you think your years of experience, all that you've experienced as a journalist and other experiences, how do you think that prepared you for this work that you're doing?
Well, thank you. And again, I'm so honored to have been asked to be here today. It's such a treat to be with all of you. I guess I would say 53 years of reporting, 52 if you subtract last year, counts in a way that it's made me more humble, frankly, about what I know as a journalist. I've spent so much of that time in Washington, D.C., covering American politics, doing some traveling, certainly during campaign years, going to conventions. But I will say that in all that time, I never felt that we in the press, in the national press, were getting out in the country enough. And so you asked me what prepared me. I think recognizing the importance of hearing American voices. I mean, our job is to cover the Congress, the White House, what's going on in Washington. These decisions are being made that affect all of our lives. How much we pay in taxes, whether we go to war or not, and everything in between. Reproductive rights, and the list goes on, what the Supreme Court does. So we need to cover that. But we also need to get out in the country. It's why, and I come back to, we need local journalism. We need state legislatures, city, county, commissions, city council, school boards. All those things need to be covered as well. And so I think more than anything, my time as a reporter has made me realize how much more work we need to do, how much we need to listen to the American people whom we are reporting for, because we call ourselves the eyes and ears of the American people. And so I think we need to make sure we know what the American people are thinking.
So, you know, my follow-up to that would be then, to what extent do you think that you have an influence on your colleagues I mean, are you seeing this kind of, you know, this is a special assignment that you've created for yourself, but are you seeing opportunities for other journalists and other, you know, other outlets to have these practices?
I think the issue of polarization has become front and center in our country today. I mean, I know University of North Carolina, other great colleges and universities are looking at it. The media is looking at it. Reporters are starting to ask questions. So I'm very pleased to have, not to be alone doing this work, that a lot of people are out there beginning to ask these kinds of questions. Because I think, you know, it's one thing. We've got this hot and heavy, and it's going to be, it already is, tough, at times ugly election underway this year. That's going to get a lot of attention. But we also, I think, need to be looking at who we are as a people, what are our priorities, and how do we keep going as a country? Do we want to just get so tied in knots with every election, and then we recover from that election, and then we get tied in knots over the next one? I think, you know, as I was trying to say, I think it's important for us to try to keep our wits about us and to focus on the long term. And I think, frankly, the American people are capable of doing that, but it is challenging. So much of the media is all about the fight. It's about who's up, who's down, who said what horrible thing about someone else. And frankly, there's just a lot more at stake than that.
Yes. Well, you know, I want to dig a little deeper there in terms of your methodology. Again, this is something you and I have talked about, and you made that conscious decision to go directly to the citizenry and to open up these spaces for dialogue. And I have to say, and I think you mentioned this a bit in some of your reporting, but also in your speech tonight, some of it is very disheartening to hear the level of the divisions and the level of as you called it, I think you termed it the dark, the painful estrangements that are happening, for example, and sort of the dark. So at the same time, I see that you, in your reporting, you've looked for those examples of people who are trying to open up the dialogues, and you mentioned some of those tonight. But can you talk more about what are some of the tools that you've seen that people are using?
Absolutely, and we save the positive for now. But you're right, there are groups out there, so-called bridging groups, and I'm sure they are working here in Chapel Hill and I know they're working across North Carolina and across the country to try to find ways to bring people together. One is called Braver Angels. We interviewed some of the people they put together for us in Cleveland. There's a group called Common Ground. There's a group called Listen First. So many others. I'm told there are hundreds and hundreds of them that are trying to find ways to get people just to have a conversation, so that instead of assuming, as soon as you learn that someone is of another political party, that you don't want to have anything to do with them, that you find something that you can base a conversation on, something that you can, so that you can understand better where that person's coming from. It doesn't mean you're going to agree with them. You may completely disagree with their belief, but you at least have a somewhat better understanding. And all in an effort to keep our discourse as civil as possible. Nothing wrong with disagreement. Disagreement, open debate, that's what a democratic society is all about. But it's this notion that the other side is un-American, even evil. I mean, we're hearing that word thrown around now, that if one party loses or if one party wins, that's going to be the evil side, and, you know, God help us all. You know, we have to get, in my humble opinion, this country will survive. The American people are strong. We will get through whatever the result of this election. I know some people are worrying about worse kinds of conflict. I'm not going to go there. I don't think that's in the cards at all. But I know that there is now, and there will continue to be, real ugly arguments over what's going on. And I think all of us can contribute to that by trying to ask questions. Like, for example, some of these groups are experimenting with, if I'm meeting you, Pat Parker, for the first time, and I know you have different views than I have, so that instead of going right to whatever subject we disagree on, whether it's government spending or abortion, okay, where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? Where do you like to vacation? Having a conversation that gets, so that I can know you as a person before I decide that what I think about you. And those sound like little things, and they almost sound too obvious, but we're having to go back to square one, I think, in many respects.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as we've discussed before, I mean, this is foundational in the field of communication writ large, and certainly in my area in communication studies. And it's it's foundational to having meaningful conversations. But the challenge, of course, which is what I think you're meeting, is getting people in the room together to begin with. And I think that's the call, and you've sort of placed that call to each of us here, that it's up to us to sort of engage in these kinds of approaches that create spaces for dialogue. I mean, to me, that's one of the takeaways that I get from what you're doing, and one of the ways that we're doing this in the Department of Communication here is thinking about how do you get people to the table, and then giving them tools for those kinds of conversations to happen.
So much of this is you're exactly right, Pat. So much of this is, it's person to person. It's one living room at a time, one coffee shop around the table at a time. But that's what it's going to take, I think. We all want to believe that at some point it's going to scale up and be bigger than that. But in many places, the places that we've covered, we talked to Braver Angels in Ohio. They're working, I think, in every state in the country. We've been contacted by a group that is trying to bring people together, and it's slow. It's one group at a time, one neighborhood at a time, and maybe it is going to take a long time. But in my view, we don't have any choice. I mean, the alternative is to give up and say, we're not going to worry about it. We're just going to go in our separate directions, and we're going to split as a country. Yeah. And again, I don't think Americans want that. Right. Most Americans. Having just come back from Oregon, I will tell you, some people are, as I said, in the eastern part of the state, they want to leave Portland behind and join Idaho.
Well, I mean, I would say that kind of context is the very place that would be the test for what we're talking about, right? When you have that kind of, those kinds of beliefs, and if there are people who are creating spaces in that context, I think that's the test. But I want to move on to talk about, and then I'll open it up for questions. I know that as part of your project, you visited college campuses around the country, and certainly UNC is not the only place where, campuses are grappling with some issues of debate and free speech and safety and so forth. What advice would you give students for engaging with some of these issues, if you are thinking about, because you've visited some of the college campuses, what have you learned there, and what advice would you give students who are here?
Well, I'm far be it from me to give advice. I'm learning from students for the most part, rather than trying to tell them what to do. The only thing I could say is that college campuses are places, obviously places of learning, places of open debate. It's the place one goes as a young person to hear new ideas, to learn different viewpoints. And there ought to be space for a whole spectrum of viewpoints. There are some limits that different campuses want to put on just what those viewpoints can be. Advocating violence, clearly, I think is off the charts, and other horrendous things. But other than that most extreme example, we should be having these debates on college campuses. We should be discussing hard questions. We should be hearing from people who are knowledgeable, who've done a lot of scholarly work, and hearing what they believe and why they believe it, and having open debate. That's how we learn. It's how maybe we'll change our view, or maybe we won't. But to me, that's what's so great about the American educational system, is that there shouldn't be, for the most part, shouldn't be limits on free speech, with the kinds of exceptions that, I think pretty much we all agree on. Having said that, I know that it's sensitive, it's touchy. A number of campuses have struggled with this. We've seen it, especially since the Israel-Hamas war, and that's such a painful subject. We all pray that conflict comes to an end as soon as possible.
Yes, we do. So now I want to open it for questions, and so if you have a question, if you could make your way to the microphone. Looks like we have someone. And if you would just limit your question to one. I'm sure you would. My staff told me I had to say that so we can stay on time. But yes, please go ahead.
Hi.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to hear you speak tonight. My question is that I hear a lot of critiques of the news press, and I want you to reflect on your time of covering Trump. What advice would you give reporters today? What's the best way to cover Trump? And do you have any regrets or thoughts on how you covered him?
Are you a journalist?
No, I'm a doctor.
An MD?
Yeah.
Okay, great question, and a difficult question. I haven't personally been out on the campaign trail because I was an anchor when he was elected, during the time he was running for president, and then in the White House, and have been doing this project for the last 2 years as this presidential campaign was getting underway. I have been in his presence in a number of situations with other reporters and been able to ask him questions, but I have not been out on the trail, so to speak, or at the White House covering him day in and day out. I'm careful about throwing stones at other people for what they do wrong. I think my advice is pretty simple. Cover him in a way that holds him accountable, as we do all public servants. And that means if, asking whoever the politician is, in this case, the former president, if he makes a statement, you want to know, what do you base that on? Why? And then challenging him if the statement isn't borne out. It doesn't mean you'll get an answer, but I think reporters absolutely have the same responsibility covering him that they do any other politician. There's no question he's sui generis. We've never had a president of the United States like him, and he has presented real serious challenges to the press in terms of understanding, what is our role? How do we hold someone accountable who holds the positions that he does and who says some of the things that he does? But we have to keep at it. The reporters who cover him, and I know a number of them, I was just with some of them over the weekend, a young woman who's going to start to cover former President Trump for the Wall Street Journal. And I think they have 4 or 5 reporters, and they understand the challenge of it. But it's a 24/7 job. When he was in the White House, as soon as we all woke up in the morning, and I was the anchor of the PBS NewsHour then, the first thing we did was check our Twitter feed to see if some national pronouncement had been made overnight. And so it's never quiet. But in all seriousness, reporters need to hold him as accountable as they do everyone else. And that means not stopping, not just because a question isn't answered. Keep at it, keep at it, keep at it. I hope I partly answered your question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Let's move over here.
so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your presentation. The research is very clear, whether it's Pew, whether it's NPR, whether it's University of Texas, that the more education that you have, the more liberal you become. So I'd love to hear your reflections and how you make meaning of that when we think about the divide and this America being at a crossroads. And considering what's happening on many college campuses, in particular public institutions, the attempt to, let's just say, have more control of what happens in the classroom.
I think I caught the last part. You're asking about states beginning to interfere with curriculum on state schools, which we are seeing in a number of, or a growing number of states across the country. In terms of people, I think it was a two-part question about people. The more education they have, the more liberal they become. In general, that is the case, but there are clearly exceptions to it. There are people supporting former President Trump or people who vote consistently conservative who have master's, graduate, PhDs, who are engineers, doctors, and so on. And so it's not like everybody who has an education becomes more liberal. But yes, in general, that is correct. Democrats generally profile higher education. But the other question that you asked about what is happening within the last couple of years when state governments, Florida is a good example. We've seen it in Oklahoma, state that I mentioned in my talk. We are seeing governors, state legislatures decide that, and I can't speak about North Carolina. I'm not as up to speed on what is your state legislature's doing. You can fill me in on that, okay? But it is the case that our elected leaders have decided that they need to weigh in on what's being taught. And it's whether it's the history of race, whether it's in the K through 12 education system. Clearly they're weighing in there. And they're weighing in on what I visited a campus in Florida, the New College of Florida, which has lost almost half of its faculty because of restrictions placed on what they can teach, how they can teach history, what they can teach with regard to gender studies, and so forth. So we are in a time of turmoil and change. And again, I hope that our citizens will take it upon themselves in their busy lives to educate themselves about what's going on and speak up. Because so often we're just hearing from one side on the far right or the far left, and we don't hear from people in the middle. We don't hear from enough people. And I think our politicians need to hear if people are unhappy with what's going on. They need to hear that. But it is something we're watching. It's a story I know that the NewsHour has covered. We did reporting on it, some reporting on it for Crossroads. And we're watching to see where it goes from here. But it's a phenomenon that I don't think is going away quickly, because I think it's when our elected political leaders decide, take it upon themselves to want to put their hands into our education system, a lot of things can happen, and some maybe they're good and some may not be so good. And we need to have these discussions and debates across political lines. It shouldn't be just the folks who are on campus who debate. The public needs to get involved as well. But thank you.
Thank you.
I can't hear very well. Yeah.
I said, thank you for being here. Thank you for your conversation. As somebody who's been in the industry for over 50 years, and as somebody who's constantly doing research and traveling over the country, what are some ideas for what the journalism industry may look like in the future, or what it should look like to report effectively?
Did you say what journalism should look like?
Mm-hmm.
Is that, well, I hope that journalism will stay strong, that it will be fact-based, that we will have as much fact-based reporting as we do opinions that are being thrown around right now. That worries me a lot. I worry that there is so much just junk flying around on the internet, social media, that people are taking as fact. I worry more than anything that we have a place where if you are here on the political spectrum, you can go there for your news source. And if you're there on the political spectrum, you can go there. And you don't see anything in the middle that is what I call fact-based reporting, because when we have a situation where the American people are getting two completely different sets, at least two completely different sets of information and facts, how do we come to any sort of middle ground? How do we solve the great problems of our time, whether it's immigration or the environment, what to do about our spending priorities, foreign policy? If people are getting a set of information that completely conflicts or is contradictory or rejects what the other side is hearing, it just makes it that much harder. So I don't, are you interested in going into journalism? Are you already a journalist?
Student.
A journalism student, right? What are you interested in doing?
Photojournalism.
Did you say photo? Terrific. That's terrific. Well, I tell young people today, please go into journalism. We need smart, dedicated, energetic, curious young people to go into journalism, work hard at it, and you'll have crazy hours. Totally unpredictable, but one thing is for certain, you will never be bored. It is not boring to be a reporter. It's one of the reasons I feel so blessed and so lucky to have had the career that I have. But I encourage you to go into journalism. The landscape is changing. You heard me talk about the collapse of local journalism. There are so many efforts out there right now to try to rebuild local journalism, philanthropic efforts, nonprofits, trying to get people to contribute to rebuilding newspapers, especially digital news locally. And that's happening in many parts of the country. It remains to be seen how it can be a viable business model, which is why the philanthropic piece is there. There's even some conversation about whether there should be government taxpayer support for journalism, because it's such a vital part of our democracy, and yet it's disappearing before our eyes. I think it's an interesting question, and I think it's one that we need to be having. But there's always going to be a need for information. To function as citizens, we need information, and that's going to come from journalists, including videographers and photographers in the area that you're interested in. It's all important. So I encourage you, stay with it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
That's interesting. That's one of we talked about this at lunch with the students, these models, emerging models to save local news outlets and some others that are based on, quite frankly, the PBS model and the NPR model. And so it's very complex there in terms of having government affiliated media. That's a scary prospect to most people, but it works for PBS and
It's worked, as we were discussing today at lunch, it's worked for public broadcasting, it's worked for National Public Radio, in that there's been no interference. I mean, we clearly had politicians threaten to do away with public media, going back to Richard Nixon. I think it was Mitt Romney who talked about killing Big Bird. And there have been others, but so far we're hanging in there. And the reason is we find that in individual communities, the public television station, the public radio station have a very solid base of support in community after community after community. I do a lot of traveling around the country talking to invited by public TV stations, radio, and I find people in the community who swear by their local PBS or NPR station. But your point, Pat, about the model that it sets, yes, we do receive money from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which has money that comes from the Congress. So some of that funds, for example, what the NewsHour does, what Frontline does on PBS and other programs. But in general, we depend on viewers like you. That's why the tote bag and the coffee mug are essential to our profile. So keep that in mind when you see them holding out the tin cup
That's right.
on your on North Carolina public radio, public television, and radio.
I'm glad we got that in.
Ms. Woodruff, thank you very much for being here in these terribly polarizing times. We've heard reference so many times, such animosity between two camps that you're referring to. And in March Madness, we have to remember there's not just Duke, and there's not just UNC, but there's a whole lot of Wolfpack Nation out there as well. And I thought of that when you were recounting your more recent activities and your engagement, and it was always with the Republicans or the Democrats, and not with that vast number of Americans who identify with neither of those two parties. And in fact, as those affiliations have shrunk, perhaps they've become far more extreme. Is there indeed an independent voter in America, or is that a mirage and they're simply unwilling to affiliate? And if there is a legitimate independent American electorate, are they part of this conversation from a DC-centric view where everything is only those two parties?
Very, very good question. And yes, absolutely, there is a middle. There are people who are sick of both sides. There are disaffected Democrats. There certainly right now are disaffected Republicans, staunch conservatives who can't stand what's happened to their party. They've rejected the party. There clearly are people in the middle. It's harder to pin them down, to find them, because they don't speak up as much. And honestly, what pollsters tell me and tell others is that even though people like to say they are in the middle, in general, most people lean one way or another. That's why when the pollsters go out and they ask, you know, where do you place yourself on the political spectrum? You know, there's a small percentage, the far left and the far right, but the numbers get larger as you get to the middle, and those people, they may say, I'm not a staunch Republican or a staunch Democrat, but I kind of lean or tend to vote Republican or Democrat. So we are, yes, there are people, some in the middle, there's no question. A lot of Americans are just had it up to here with the fighting that's going on. But having said that, most people have taken a position. I mean, our elections are binary for the most part. I mean, when Ross Perot got, what, 19% of the vote in 1992, George H.W. Bush's family never forgave fellow Texan Ross Perot because they think, you know, he helped hand that election to Bill Clinton. So third-party candidates can make a difference. There's no question. We've seen them tip the balance, but pulling off a coup, if you will, and winning a presidential election as an independent, it's tough. It's tough because our system is so geared to the political parties. There are efforts underway right now. I mentioned partisan primaries. There's gerrymandering. There are all sorts of efforts underway right now to try to departisanize, if you will, if that's a word, our primary system, because the primaries now, as you know, look at Congress. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when my husband and I first started dating, when we're about to celebrate our 44th wedding anniversary next week. When we first started going out, and after we were married, we would have people over for dinner. We'd have Democrats and Republicans. And Washington then had a number of liberal, or I should say moderate Republicans, even liberal Republicans, who were more, how do I put this, more to the left than the most conservative Democrats. And conversely, Democrats had some conservatives who were more conservative than the most liberal. In other words, they overlap. Now you don't see that. And why is that? It's the primary process. It's the money, it's the incentive. The incentive is to you toe the line, you are with us on these issues, or we're not giving you a dime for your race. We're gonna primary you. We're gonna run somebody against you, and there's just not the incentive to be. I mean, in fact, there's a disincentive to run in either party and then hew to the middle. Both parties, and I would say in particular the Republicans, expect you to toe the line and never work with the other side, except on the most non-controversial issues. It's not that they never work together, they do work together, but they tend to be, they are always on issues that are not the toughest. I mean, look at what's happened right now on spending, look at immigration, some tough environmental questions. You know, the divide is just like this. It's right down the middle. And that's where we are in the presidential numbers right now. I don't know if I'm sure I didn't answer your question,
Well,
but it was a good one.
I thank you very much for the attempt to answer the unanswerable. And go Wolfpack, by the way.
Thank you. Go NC State.
You already touched on this a little bit, but I figured I would ask anyway if you had additional reflections in your encounters with ordinary people over the past couple of years. If you, noticed any changes or had any reflections on the change in perception over time of PBS and reactions to when you say I'm reporting with PBS, especially the various subgroups, Republicans, Democrats, younger people versus older generations. If you had any additional reflections, otherwise we can move on to the next.
Yeah, I want to make sure I understood the question.
The way I'm hearing the question, what have you noticed in terms of changes in perception of PBS?
Is that what you're asking? In
Yeah.
perceptions of PBS
Yes.
by voters? I would say, well, clearly what is going on right now is that the trust in media broadly has declined dramatically. I mean, somebody cited it for us at lunch today, how much it's gone down. Mainstream media is not trusted. And I mean, this started probably 2015, 2016, and it's down in the 20s, the 30s, the percentage of people who say they trust generally the media. From what I've seen, the trust in public broadcasting, both television and radio, has remained about where the trust is in other media, but slightly higher because we have tried to stay in the middle. But I will tell you, it's tough. I mean, there are times I will go out and people will say, I don't want to talk to you because you're part of the mainstream media. Occasionally somebody has said, I don't want to talk to you because you're PBS. Gratefully, I haven't heard that very much. But I do hear people say, well, I don't trust anybody in the media. You're a reporter. I don't want to talk to you. And so we have to be very persuasive in getting people to talk to us because, and we are. I mean, I work very, very hard with my team of producers to get people to open up to talk to us. I spent last Thursday, the whole day, half the day out in the cow pasture in central eastern Oregon with a gentleman who's a very conservative individual who's part of this movement to secede from Oregon. And we, just like everyone else we talked to, I mean, he had to understand what we were doing, the point of the project. I will say that I think the fact that our project is an attempt to understand differences and we go in saying, we want to listen to you. We want to hear what you have to say. We're not here to, play gotcha. I think that helps to a large degree. But I'm not going to pretend that everybody in the world is trusting of all of media or PBS. It's just not. I mean, we are in a very tough place, and all of us in the news media have to work nonstop, day in and day out, to earn people's confidence and their trust. I tell my colleagues at the NewsHour that the only thing we have, frankly, is our credibility as a news organization. And once we lose that, it's very difficult to get it back. And so we have to work every day with every story we do, every piece we do, whether it's online, on television, something we tweet out or put on Facebook or Instagram. It's got to be accurate and it's got to be fair. So I'm very conscious of that, and I know my colleagues at the NewsHour are.
Thank you for the question. Thank you. Yes.
Judy, thank you for coming. I enjoyed your optimism. It's very refreshing. I'm not sure I share that same optimism, but that's okay. I don't have a question. It seems to be sort of a listening tour, so I thought I'd give you a soundbite from Chapel Hill, so in your future tours you can say, oh, I heard this from a gentleman in Chapel Hill the other day. I've tried the meeting in the middle of our local community. We had some discussion groups, and they did not go very well, and I don't think it really moves the needle very much. I think what we really need to do is have our leaders address some of the big structural problems that we have in this country that no one really has the appetite to address. Things like the tax code that has hollowed out the middle class, campaign finance reform that's led to a lot of the problems that you touched on, gerrymandering, you talked about that. These are some of the big things that are going to really move the needle for this country, and without fixing some of those problems, the neighborhood get-togethers I don't think are going to make the difference that we need.
May I ask if that was if the gatherings that you took part in, were they organized by a outside group, or did you just spontaneously do this in your own?
We spontaneously did that because we thought maybe it'd be a good approach. We're not associated with any group. We spontaneously thought, let's have some dinner meetings and try and get together and work through some of these and find common ground. And it actually, we found out it was more divisive than it helped.
Well, that's discouraging. That's discouraging. Can you give us an example of something that was discussed that went in the wrong direction?
Well, I think, so you spend an hour trying to share different ideas, but then people go home and they consume 5 hours the next day, or 5 hours each day for weeks from the news sources, and so you can't, 1 hour a week or a month doesn't counterbalance all the misinformation that both sides are sort of getting. Maybe we needed a professional facilitator or better tools to do that, but we tried, and we're all pretty highly educated people, but we couldn't find any common ground.
Yeah, that's discouraging. It is just flat.
Yeah, I didn't mean to dampen your enthusiasm.
Well, may I underscore the intention to seek a communication facilitator? Because I think that is something, but I applaud you for doing that. And I will share one thing that I see in what Judy is doing that's a bit different from what you said that you're trying. I think that, especially in the case, the last example that you gave with the person that you spent the day with, who is out in his ranch and didn't expect to be heard, creating a space for people to hear themselves think, to hear what they think out loud. It's sort of like caucusing. So I think what you're creating is this opportunity for people who haven't been heard in connection to a strategy toward bridges. So in other words, before people are in the room, having some way of critical self-reflection, and I think that's what you are creating. If we go and watch maybe you'll see some of the folks who are in that room with you in one of Judy's sessions, talking among themselves, and that becomes an opportunity for you to be able to see and hear them in a way that you might not have been able to do that in the space where you're there confronting each other. Just offering that as a tool.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point about whether a facilitator, somebody who is not from your neighborhood, could come in and carry the conversation through. But I don't underestimate the difficulty of it. I have certainly in the last years talked to people on both sides, and there's not a lot of room in the views of many people for the other. There's not a willingness to hear the other side, and so I don't underestimate the difficulty of it. So I'm going to remember this from Chapel Hill.
We have just about 4 minutes left, and so I hope we get to all of our questions. Please.
Thank you so much. This has been so helpful to understand where you're about, both on the grassroots level and on a reporter anchor level. My question is really more about the level that you've been talking about with mainstream media. In particular, we've had a lot of discussions about inviting a lot of different voices into the room and hearing what each other has to say. There's sort of a hot potato issue right now with one of the major networks about bringing into the fold someone that a number of people in the organization were not happy with. So what's the role of an anchor or a news organization to curate the people that they bring into the discussion that all of us hear at night when we turn on the news?
The role of the anchor and others in making those decisions?
And the mainstream media sources who, you know, in the case of
Right.
NBC, has made
Well,
a fairly controversial decision.
Every news organization is different in the way it functions and who's calling the shots and who's making those decisions. And sometimes one side may not talk to everybody they need to talk to, which appears to have happened in the case of MSNBC. But I mean, I will tell you, going way back, I've had a problem for a long time with news organizations hiring former practitioners, political practitioners. I don't have anything against people who've been in politics, but when you sort of populate your discussion with people who ran a campaign or who, I mean, you know where they're coming from, and you make them an anchor. I mean, I know there are plenty of good people on television who are former White House aides or White House this or that, or campaign managers. But I mean, as a journalist, I'm really old-fashioned about it. I think journalists ought to be doing journalism. But as you know very, very well, what's happened is we have this cable news model where every hour you need another panel of people to discuss and debate. And so inevitably it makes a livelier conversation if you know you've got the best spokesperson for that side and the best spokesperson for the other side. But in terms of who makes the decision, it's different in every place. I mean, the anchors should be consulted, but ultimately it's management that makes the people who are responsible for closing the books every month are going to be the ones who make the decision.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have just about 1 minute left. If we could hear the questions from each of the last two questioners. Each ask their question, and I'm going to add one that was submitted before, which is this one. Are there times when polarization is a productive tool for progress? So just have that question out there. And would you ask your question, please?
So lately in media, I've heard a lot of talk about America should abolish the two-party system altogether. Do you think this is even possible? How do you feel about it? What are the goods and bads, pros and cons of the two-party system as a whole?
And your question?
After 5 decades of covering politics with NBC and CNN and PBS and so forth, I am exhausted watching television, the news, because they're only talking about Trump and his cases and what's happening there. I'd like to, if you could bring forth to your colleagues the idea of helping to educate them about what the Biden-Harris administration has done in terms of the Chips and Science Act, the Respect for Marriage Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure laws, what they've done for gun safety and so forth. And maybe they could spend some time talking about that, or where those programs are in the pipeline to help changing Americans' lives.
Thank you. Those are all great questions, and I'll just tackle them very quickly. On this one, I think you're describing a news media ecosystem that is, you're right, very focused on the horse race, but not everybody. I commend the PBS NewsHour to you because it does cover those issues across the spectrum, whether it's the budget or the environment, infrastructure, and so on. The question about political parties, there are efforts right now to departisize our primary system. Alaska and 4 other states have begun to reform the primary process to try to make it less partisan. How do you do that? And without going into detail, there's something called ranked choice voting, or a version of that that's being tried, which clearly would take away some of the partisanship out there. So there are ways of doing it. And the scholars we've talked to
say that if you can make the primary process less partisan, you can go a long way toward making a difference. And of course, there's gerrymandering and everything else. But to get to your point, I don't think tomorrow we're going to do away with the two political parties. Too much of our system is organized around that. But there are ways of cutting back on their power if you can put them to sleep and do it while they're sleeping.
Yeah.
And your question about is politicization good? I'm sorry, polarization.
Productive.
Too many P words, partisanship. Is it ever good? What is good is debate, open debate, honest debate, vigorous debate. That's what's good. That's what our democracy is all about. What isn't good is when we're arguing for the sake of argument, when we cast the other side as evil, un-American. That's what we don't want. And so it's healthy to have arguments over, you name it. Let's get it out there. Let's argue. But let's not turn it into a hate fest, which is what I think so much of what our politics has turned into.
Well, you're taking us very far in countering that propensity. And so thank you so much. And please join me in thanking Judy Woodruff. I see that you see some of your friends. So thank you all so much. Thanks again to the Will. I hope you have a good evening. Thank you very much for coming.